Hey everybody, it's Boo-Ray Perry from Tampa, Florida, and today we are going to talk about the Fuji X100F and its auto ISO settings, how I set mine up, and a little bit about why I set mine up the way that I do. Before we get started though, just a quick reminder, I have a fantastic podcast. It's called Photobomb, and me and Gary Hughes, we have a great time every week. It's funny, it's irreverent, we talk about the life of a professional photographer, and we cover what's going on in photography news that week. Check it out anywhere that podcast can be found. I've also got a great group on Facebook called Pro Photo Talk with Boo-Ray Perry. Please join and get involved with the community. We're all there for each other, and we're there to help each other out. It's called Pro Photo Talk with Boo-Ray Perry. And if you go to my website, and there's a link right in the description directly below this video, you can find every single thing that I carry, be it stuff for my Fuji X100F or stuff for my Canon gear when I'm shooting professionally. It's all there. So I get so many questions when people say, what's that umbrella that you use? Or what's that strap that you use? It's all right there, and it's an Amazon link, and if you use one of those links, I make maybe $1, and it helps to keep this this channel going, so be sure and check those out. All right, so let's talk about the Fuji X100F. Let's talk about the ISO settings when we're talking about the auto ISO setting on this camera. But first, let me tell you a little bit about how this has changed the way that I shoot. When I'm shooting professionally, say I'm shooting a wedding on the beach, and it's natural light, right? It's very, very bright. So what I do is I set my ISO to 100. I set my camera to AV mode, which is aperture priority, which means I set my aperture and the camera sets my shutter speed. Now, it's ISO 100 because it's so bright on the beach. I know I need to be at ISO 100 no matter what. And I don't have to worry about the shutter speed because it's so bright on the beach that no matter what I select for my aperture, the shutter speed is always going to be high. The camera is going to select a high shutter speed in order to give me the proper exposure. Except sometimes there's clouds. Sometimes there's a storm rolling in. Sometimes the wedding is running late and it's getting close to dark. And when that happens, the camera will start to select a shutter speed that is slower and perhaps too slow for the long lens that I've got on my camera. And so when that happens, I will quickly reach up, I will click the ISO button, and I will change my ISO to 200 or 400 or even 600 in order to make sure that the camera keeps my shutter speed high. Now that's how I shoot professionally. It's how I've always shot professionally. Then I bought the Fuji X100F, and I wanted to make it as simple as possible when I was taking pictures on vacation and stuff. I didn't want to have to fool with any dials that were unnecessary. I knew that I wanted to be able to set my aperture myself. That was a priority, so I wanted to keep that. But I decided to let the camera set the ISO and the shutter speed both for me. Now, remember, when I work professionally, I let the camera set the shutter speed, but I set the ISO. So with the Fuji, I decided to let the camera set the ISO too. And once I started doing that, I realized that there was no reason that I couldn't also be doing that when I work professionally. I could cut that step out. When I'm working on the beach and suddenly it gets a little darker, I have to notice that my shutter speed is getting lower so that I can then change my ISO. When I'm using my Fuji, I don't have to notice anything. If it gets darker, the Fuji automatically will change my ISO, will automatically make it higher so that my shutter speed does not drop too low. I get to tell the Fuji what my shutter speed threshold is. I get to say, don't ever let my shutter speed drop below a 60th of a second. If it starts to drop below a 60th of a second, Fuji will automatically take my ISO and just raise it up for me. And I also get to tell the Fuji where I want my ISO to go. Don't go any higher than 3200 ISO, whatever number I select. And the thing is, Canon has the same setting. I could do the same thing in Canon. Now, I don't, because when I'm working at the beach, I've been doing it for so long that it's so dialed in and natural to me to shoot the way that I do that I really don't necessarily see the need for it. But if I was starting fresh today, I think I would be using the auto ISO setting on my Canon, the same way that I use the auto ISO setting on the Fuji X100F. So let's take a look at how I set up my camera and my auto ISO. I have my ISO button set up to the 3 o'clock position on the back of my camera, and I have my film simulations set up to the 9 o'clock position on the left. And here's why I do it this way. It helps me remember. See, if you hit the film simulation button on the left, you'll notice that most of the writing is on the left side of that vertical line, and if you hit the ISO button on the right, most of the writing that you look at, the setting numbers, they're on the right side of the line. And this is how my visual brain processes it and helps me remember which button does which. So I set it up pretty simple. My ISO base is 200 for all three of my auto settings, and my ISO limit is 12,800 for all three of my ISO settings. My shutter speed is the only thing that changes. Auto 1 is 160, Auto 2 is 1/125, and Auto 3 is 1/500th of a second. That's all there is to it. Now, if you want to change it, all you have to do is bring up the auto setting and then hit the menu button right in the center, and it will bring it up, and then you can instantly change to whatever you want. But our goal is to have those three settings cover 99% of what we do, so we never have to touch it. So here's why I set it up the way that I do. First of all, the ISO setting. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer. You're just going to tell the camera to set the ISO as low as you possibly can, because that's just basically the rule that you live by with any camera that you ever shoot with. I don't know anyone who would set their camera to a higher ISO than absolutely necessary. That's not the way it works. I mean, setting a higher ISO just gives you more grain. It doesn't give you a good effect. So always have the camera shoot as low ISO as you can, and for Fuji, the default low ISO is 200. So shutter speed. Shutter speed is where we get a little tricky, because I've discovered with the Fuji that I tend to have more camera shake blur in my photos than I do when using my Canon. And at first I didn't understand this, because with the Canon I'm frequently using a longer lens than the 35mm equivalent that is on the Fuji, and the Canon camera is so much heavier, right, and bulkier, and you would think I couldn't hold it as steady. And I think what it is, well, there's no image stabilization inside the Fuji X100F body, but there's no image stabilization in the Canon either, but sometimes the lens is image stabilized. But here's the thing. I think what it is that because the camera is so light and small, that I don't hold it the same way. When I'm using my camera, my Canon, I'm holding it up to my eye and I'm locked in. I'm making sure I've got a good grip on it because I'm very aware of the weight of the camera. But when I'm using the Fuji, I might just be holding it out in front of me like this, or moving it around quickly trying to get pictures, and moving in ways that I would never do with my professional gear. And so that's when I think I end up with blur in my pictures. And I realize I don't lock it all up and like, okay, make sure I'm holding it nice and tight, when I don't really do that with the Fuji. And as a result, I need to have a higher shutter speed to make sure that my pictures come out okay. Sometimes I'm shooting from the hip, right? Sometimes I'm shooting while walking. Not really something I do too much with my professional gear. So I start at a 60th of a second. A 60th of a second is a good handheld shutter speed, as long as you've got no movement in front of you. You're going to be fine at a 60th of a second. Now, you can probably handhold this camera much slower if you really want to. If you're shooting a landscape, if you're shooting really wide, you're going to have a very deep depth of field anyway, you're fine. But if you're shooting a picture of people, which is typically what I'm doing, I want to make sure that they're in focus. A 60th of a second is about as low as I want to go with the Fuji. My next setting, 1/25th. 1/25th is a little bit faster, and I use that when there's a little movement in the room. People are moving about just a little bit. Okay, 125. That's going to give me, I'm not going to get any camera shake at 125. At 60, I need to be aware of how I'm holding the camera. At 125, I don't have to worry about it too much. And then finally, 500. And a 500th of a second, that's when I know there's movement. Maybe I'm moving, maybe the people moving, maybe it's, who knows what craziness is going on, but I need to make sure that my shutter speed is so fast that it's going to lock everything down and freeze everybody with a nice clean focus. And that's 500th of a second. The final setting is the top end for the ISO. Now, I originally had the top end set to 6400. Don't ever go above 6400. And then I realized why. Because if the camera is trying to push the ISO to 6400, then I must be in a really dark place, which means I'm probably shooting wide open already. And my shutter speed is going to be as low as I can go. And so why do you want it to not go above 6400? Would you rather not get the picture? Because that's what's going to happen, right? I mean, better to get the picture at 12,000 than with grain than not get the picture at all. Film, it doesn't cost us anything, so why not let it go over 6400 if it has to go over 6400? This is my philosophy anyway. So anyway, those are my settings, and that's how I set up my camera. And I'll be honest, I change those settings from time to time. Even though I've had the camera for a couple of years now, I still am kind of dialing in different settings from time to time, really getting a feel for it, but, you know, for exactly what's going to work in each situation. Because I'm the kind of guy who, it's a nice game to try and figure out if I can come up with the 3 exact perfect settings that work in every situation. So I'm always messing around with it. So if you've got some suggestions or some ideas for how you set up yours and why, I would love to hear about them. Please put them in the comments. And thanks for watching.